So there's this batshit crazy guy. Sorry, I forgot to present both sides of the argument. As a secular, godless, rationalist sort, I think this guy's batshit crazy. But the other side thinks that he can perform miracle healings.
I prayed, and the instant I put my hands on her feet and said, "My King," God cured her the incurable neurological disease in her legs. Instantly. She felt icicles shooting out of her toes. She was cured instantly and permanently. She hasn't had a single neuropathy pain since.
And that God called him to YouTube to prove God's existence on YouTube.
God told me to make this video about 2 o'clock this afternoon.
And that the craters of the moon were caused by Noah's flood.
These craters on the moon were caused by water that ejected from inside the earth at the beginning of the Noachian flood.
And yeah, would you believe it, that's actually a widely held position in the creationist community. Anyway, this batshit crazy guy, presumably at God's instruction, suggested that the nozzle size would be a factor in how high up the water would spurt. Well, that really does highlight the problem with the other side of the argument, with those who obtain their knowledge of physics by praying to a scientifically illiterate figment of their own imagination. You see, anyone who has actually cracked open a physics book will pretty soon come across this concept called conservation of energy. And from that alone, many would be able to figure out why this creationist is talking bull. Although to demonstrate this is a little more tricky. So how can you actually instantly know that his God is wrong? Well, the potential energy of an object is determined only by its height. It's what's called a state function. It doesn't matter how it got there. Once it gets there, its potential energy is only determined by its height. Well, in the creationist problem, we know the initial height, and therefore we know the initial potential energy. We know how much energy is delivered by the only declared energy source, the falling rock, and therefore we can absolutely determine the final height of the mass of the expelled water. It's a state function. You simply cannot get around it. It's conservation of energy. Great. So that's how you can tell that the nozzle size cannot be a factor. But why? Well, let's explain this by a simple example. Firstly, we will need to build a couple of constant pressure generators. There, done. Now, the pressure applied at any particular depth depends only on the height of water above a certain point. So for both of these bottles, at a certain depth, there will be a constant pressure for both of these bottles. Now let's drill two different hole sizes in both of these bottles. Nice thin walls, good for an approximation to a zero friction system. We drill one big hole and one little one. Now when the water is expelled from these bottles, there are two forces acting on it. It obviously accelerates downwards due to gravity, but its lateral velocity is constant, and that's determined by some factors relating to the pressure that we will come to later. So this is now the model. We have two constant pressure generators, one with a small nozzle, the other with a bigger one. Which will produce the faster water jet, and why? Well, it turns out they produce exactly the same parabola, bar a little air resistance. That is, they both have the same nozzle velocity. And just to show that one genuinely does have a bigger hole, you can see that water is draining significantly faster from the bottle on the left than on the right. So changing the hole size really doesn't change the nozzle velocity, but a bigger hole does allow a bigger flow rate. Okay, so we have demonstrated that nozzle size isn't a factor. But why? Well, let's make life simple and take another two-dimensional constant pressure system. Every point in this enclosed system has exactly the same pressure per unit area. Now let's make a hole, and you can see that we have one black arrow of force, that used to be pressure, per unit area. Now double that area and you double the force available to accelerate the water, but you also double the mass of water that needs to be accelerated. The bottom line is the bigger the hole, the greater the volume of water that comes out in a given time, but the velocity is determined only by the pressure on the system, which in the current case is constant. To a degree it's the same problem as two water bottles, one half full, the other completely full. One bottle weighs about twice as much as the other one, and yet they fall at exactly the same rate. The force experienced by the heavier bottle is about twice that of the lighter bottle. That is, it weighs twice as much. But of course this means that it takes twice as much energy to accelerate. The bottom line is, in a frictionless environment, all objects fall at the same rate. This is the great thing about science. It works. It demonstrably works. Not only was getting this man to the moon a concerto of knowledge brought to a head with a crescendo of technology, it enabled beautiful moments, such as this. Tell him, Dave.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? It proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.